Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to really focus on where farmers have already gone to the step of carbon footprinting, and then what are some ideas in terms of what to do with the numbers. So the plan is that I'm going to talk about some results from two farms I do some work with. So Rees and Russell and also Hugh Jones. So we're going to look at both of those farms, their results from the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So both of them have used the same tool. So Preesa alluded to the importance of selecting the right tool and making sure if you're going to do any comparisons that you're comparing the results from the same tool. I'm going to identify some hotspots, which will be very similar to quite a lot of beef and sheep farms, and then looking at the activity that we're doing with those farms to try and address and to sort of make efficiencies wherever possible and trying to reduce the carbon that is being emitted really from these farms. And then sort of some thoughts that I have in terms of for those who are interested in sort of progressing carbon footprints themselves on their farms or had opportunities to do them, what do we need to think about before we start heading towards them? So these are the results from Hendry. I'll talk you through them. So this is the summary of the results, and again, this tool is the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So again, available to do. You can obviously there's a small charge to it, but again, you can enter your own data and submit it through this tool and get a result. So what they break it down to, and is similar to what Preesa was talking about, you've got an emissions bit. So that's the CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane that's being emitted from your farming practices. And then you have an offset graph here, which is anything that is sucking carbon out of the atmosphere generally. And that's, as Preesa talked about, that can be soil, it can be hedges, it can be woodland. And then here you've got a carbon balance. So for this farm using this tool, they are more than net zero. So they are sequestering more carbon, storing more carbon in the soils or in the hedges or the woodland on that farm than they are emitting from the production of those that are around 600 ewes on a hill farm, and taking those lambs through to finish. So that sort of, it just gives you a breakdown of, so again, so the emissions are what you are contributing, or the farm is contributing, and then we're also interested in what the farm is also capturing from the atmosphere. So again, this is a positive story from this particular farm, that they are more than net zero. When we then break it down in terms of where do those emissions come from, and this pattern you'll see is very familiar on farm. So the big chunk of carbon emissions are generally coming from livestock, and that tends to be in the form of methane. So through the digestion process that ruminants have, they produce a lot of methane as a byproduct of that digestion, and that is belched out throughout the day. And that is taken into consideration in these carbon footprints, and that's why we tend to have these higher graphs when we associate with beef and sheep on the farm. And where most of their carbon are being stored, I think it's about 95% of their carbon is being captured within their soil organic matter. So this farm has high organic matter levels, so 12% plus. Its baseline, its base soil is there's a lot of peat. So do you mean it's high organic matter soils to start with, and then through their farming practices, which is rotational grazing, using some nitrogen, but to sort of push growth on, they're sort of helping to ensure that that organic matter is being protected and ideally being built. So the other thing just to mention here, we've got a slight increase here, and it's clear on the next slide, and that's actually because they're submitting organic matter readings for their farm, is that there's actually been a reduction in between years. And so we benefit generally because of the amount of carbon that's being stored in the soil. But if we're getting results and there's a slight reduction just because perhaps of how we've sampled it the previous time or this time, is that we also recognize that how we've managed that soil has also led to some emissions coming out of the soil. So yes, we've captured a lot and we're storing a lot, but soil also has the potential to release it if there's a slight change in practice. So that's also worth making sure you're aware of. So the hotspots here, 50% of those emissions are coming from the ewes, so those animals, but in reality we are on a sheep farm, so it is without them that we are no longer a sheep farm. 13% are coming from fertilizer. So I've mentioned again, reasonable levels of fertilizer being used, not excessive, appropriate for the type of system they're running and the stocking rate they're trying to get to. So there is some possible reductions there, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be zero. There's some options that we can look at in terms of clover, and I'll talk about that in a bit. We've got a reasonable chunk from lamb finishing, but again, that's a core part of this business, taking those animals through to deadweight sales. I mentioned this reduction in organic matter, and that's due to change in practice or sampling error in the when we've looked at those fields, and about 4% from feed. So this farm is using a total mixed ration approach to when those sheep are housed. So actually trying to minimise the bought-in feed and maximise the amount of forages that can be fed to satisfy that pre-lambing diet. So where are we going to look for? So where are some ideas of sort of trying to reduce carbon? The opportunities to increase sort of soil carbon and the soil capture is still there, but could we look at other sources on that farm too? So the key thing always when we're looking at these sort of systems is ewe efficiency. So the average weight on this farm is looking at about 65 kilos when we take it at topping. So that's generally the highest weight of the year. They're in peak level really at that point. So that's sort of a fair representation. And our target for ewe efficiency, and that's sort of the proportion of weight that animal is weaning as a flock measure, is over 65% in most ewe flocks. So an example would be if you're rearing 1.65 and averaging about 26 kilos at weaning, and that's around about 90 days, 12, 13 weeks, that's where you're going to get that ewe efficiency of about 65% if you've got what ewes around that weight. So what we tend to have is if your system relies on bigger sheep, we generally want more lambs, and we want those lambs to be bigger. But the trade-off is always, are you using creep to achieve those weights? So it's about this sort of the fine balance between making sure those ewes are efficient, but we're not necessarily increasing the amount of inputs going into those farms. The other thing we're looking for is post-weaning growth rates. So as a lot of sheep farms do, occasionally struggles with post-weaning performance, particularly into the autumn. Combination of factors so is it something to do with grass quality or grass availability? Is there an element of trace element also kicking in? So we are looking at the marketing pattern, and the key thing with emissions is that it's really driven by feed intake. So the more days on farm, the more dry matter they're eating, the more likely they are to be producing more levels of methane. So the importance of removing unproductive stock and also trying to reduce days to slaughter. This farm is part of Ram Compare and are accessing really good genetics, and also because of their record keeping are able to identify the best breeds that are performing on their mainly grass-based system. And we've also working with their vet to look at the trace elements and also a mild lameness problem that affected some of those lambs last autumn time. So again, it's that combination of looking at grass availability, grass quality, and also considering health and welfare as well to try and maximise the performance of those animals. Other areas to look at, and again, it's applicable for a lot of farms, is this use of clover. So rather than like using nitrogen fertilizer, what we have to remember is nitrous oxide is still released from soils, even though they're being fertilized by clover. But what we're doing by focusing on clover is actually reducing the energy cost it takes to produce that nitrogen fertilizer and transport it and spread it, and all of those factors alongside that. So there's also on this farm, they're using chicken muck as an alternative source of P and K and also nitrogen. So again, reducing that reliance on bought-in nitrogen fertilizer. The grazing system, doing in terms of rotational grazing and management of sward height, will in time encourage that clover to come in. Some of the challenges here are lower pHs than ideal, but it links back to those high organic matter soils, partly because of the peat that's in that area. So sometimes that doesn't always work well with trying to maximize clover levels at certain times of year. There's also an element about fuel use, and we've got to be realistic about how much we can reduce that by. That's generally affected by the farm layout. So if you're having to travel distances, to look at stock. They've recently invested in a slatted floor system for one of their main sheep housing systems. So that is, it's reducing machinery of moving straw, reducing the sort of energy cost of transporting that straw onto farm. So again, all of these things are sort of small marginal gains that are all helping to reduce that number further. And we do have to point out alongside all of this is, yes, we're doing a huge amount to capture soil carbon, but is there opportunities to put hedges or additional trees onto those farms to try and improve that amount of sequestration, even though it's quite high already?